Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Samachay. This week's learning is sponsored by my parents, Robert and Paula Cohen, in loving memory of my grandmother, Sonia Washet, Azara by Yitzchak Zichronah Livracha, on her 5th yahrzeit. My grandmother was a true role model of hard work, perseverance, and optimism. The values she instilled in me continue to guide and inspire me every single day. Yehi Zichra Baruch. Okay, we're going to get started today. It's going to be we're going to really delve into this issue of the olat ha'of. So we first started with the Mishna, and maybe I'll just repeat the beginning of the Mishna because we're going to come back to here as soon as we start the Gemara with a braita that really darshans out all these things from the Psukim and how we get there, plus other things that aren't even mentioned in our Mishna. So we start off with this olat ha'of. We'll just review some of the differences between the olat ha'of and the chatat ha'of. There's a study guide today, by the way, with a list of the differences between them. The first main difference to remember always is the chatat ha'of happens at the bottom, different from the chatat behema. I'll try to keep reminding you of this because it's good to get these details straight. The chatat ha'of is the chatat behema, animal sin offering, goes at the top of the altar. That's because it says where you're supposed to place the blood, if you remember, on the four corners. So that already makes you remember. If you remember that it's supposed to go on the four corners, then you can remember the chatat's at the top. Once you start with that, it's easy to remember because then everything's the reverse when it comes to the bird. So everything else that includes the ola is done at the bottom. So that means that for the bird, it's the flip. So the ola is done at the top and the chatat is done at the bottom. Okay, and that we saw already, but I'm just reviewing it. So if it's done at the top, according to our Mishna, we're going to see a different opinion now, you go straight up to the sovev, the ledge. You don't go up to the top of the altar. You go to the sovev, the ledge, and you do everything on the ledge. And on what corner? Remember, the first corner you get to when you turn right, which is the southeast corner. Okay, that's where you do it. So you go up the ramp, you turn to the sovev, you go to that corner, you do the melika on the back of the neck, which we discussed yesterday, and then you do mavdil. Now, mavdil is to separate. We're going to talk a lot about this today. That's different from the chatat ha'of, which we don't separate, okay? Even though, I will point out today, never says in the psukim by the olat ha'of that you have to separate the head. Okay, we're going to have to figure out how they get there. It just says by the chatat, by the sin offering of the bird, you cannot sever, you don't sever its head, v'lo yavdil. Okay, you don't do it. But here it doesn't say anything, and they're going to assume you separate, and we'll get there later. Then you do mitzoy hadam, you squeeze out all the blood on the wall of the mizbech. Then you take the head, and then you take the head and you burn it on the mizbech. And then you go to the body, you take out these parts. According to the Mishna, it's 3 parts. The crop, right? That's where the food kind of gets softened. It goes from the esophagus straight to the crop. It gets softened there. From there, it goes to the gizzard, and the gizzard kind of breaks it into pieces once it's soft. So what do? You take the mor'ah, the notzah, so you take the crop, the feather, it sounds like, and the b'nei me'ayim, the intestines, which could be the gizzard, not clear, could be the part more into the gizzard. I did a Google search. I got a nice picture of like the inside of the body of a bird. It's helpful because the intestines are past the gizzard. And then you, so you take those out, you throw them to the Beit HaDeshen, and then you split the animal. And you take the body of the animal, what's left of it after you took out those parts, you break it in half, like split it down the middle, but you don't lo mavdil here, and you'll see that in the psukim. And then I'm just reading through the Mishnah and paraphrasing. By the way, you also, when you burn it, you put the salt on. I just didn't mention that. That sounds so unique here. Then you take the body that you've kind of opened up and not split in half, and you put it on the altar and you burn it. Okay? That's the main thing we need to know. Okay, we'll get back to the psukim. We'll see this in the psukim. Then we got off on a whole thing, which was exactly, almost maybe even word for word, of what we saw in Daf Kaftet Amud Bet, which was a Mishnah in the 2nd chapter, all about pigul, when it's not pigul, what kind of combination, right? Pigul, remember, you're only going to get karet, number 1, for eating the meat, not for having the thought. And this is a good review of laws of pigul. Only if it's chutz lizmano, if it's chutz l'mkamo, right outside the location, a thought that's about, I'm going to do this outside the place I'm allowed to, that doesn't create, maybe we call it pigul, but there's no karet associated with it. There is karet if it's chutz lizmano, but it has to be exclusively chutz lizmano, and everything else has to be done properly. So the Gemara, the Mishna now, we're in the middle of giving examples of when it's not done properly. And when it won't be pigul, you won't get karet for doing it. Okay, so we're at the top of our daf now, starting in Samachay at the top. Chatat ha'of shemelaka shelo lishma umitzad ha'machutz lizmano. Until now we were combining chutz zmano, chutz kamo. If you had one part was done with a thought about doing it outside its time, and one outside its place, or the reverse order, it doesn't matter. We'll see to Rabbi Yehuda, it does matter, but we're not up to him yet. Now we're combining, right, then it's not going to be karet. Now we're combining lo lishma with chutz lizmano. So if you did the melika with a thought that you're going to do it for the sake of the wrong korban, and you do the sprinkling of the blood, or in this case it's the squeezing of the blood, outside the right time, right, again, while you're doing it, you say, oh, I'm going to burn the bird outside its time. Oh, shemalach chutz zmano mitzad Moshe lo lishma. You did it in the reverse order. During the melika, you had the pigul thought, and during the sprinkling, the squeezing of the blood, you had the lo lishma thought that you're doing it for the wrong korban. Oh, right, none of these are going to be karet because the rest wasn't, right? It's disqualified for other reasons besides just the pigul reason. Oh, shemalach mitzad shelo lishma. Or, now this is a weird one. It's obviously not going to be pigul if there's no pigul machshava, but I think what they're trying to say is if both parts were done lo lishma, that still doesn't get you up to karet. Okay, karet is only for chutz lizmano, not for doing it for the sake of the wrong korban. So all these cases are zeu shelo karev matir k'mitzvato. This wasn't done properly, and therefore, right, the rest of it wasn't done right, which means it's disqualified for some other reason, which means you're not going to get karet for eating the meat. What if you have a thought? Another thing that comes up exactly in that Mishnah, le'echol kezayit b'chutz v'kezayit l'machal. While you're slaughtering, let's say, you say, you have a thought, I'm going to eat part of the meat outside and part of the meat outside of the right, part of it outside the space and part of it outside of the right time. Or, kezayit l'machar, kezayit b'chutz. It doesn't matter the order, whether chutz zmano comes first or chutz zmano comes second. Kechatzi zayit b'chutz, and even if you have chatzi zayit b'chutz, chatzi zayit l'machar, half a kezayit I'm going to eat outside of its time and half a kezayit I'm going to eat outside of its place. Or kechatzi zayit l'machar, chatzi zayit b'chutz. Okay, either, right, actually I did that one wrong. It's first out of place and then out of time, then, or first out of time, then out of place. Pasul ve'ein bo karet. Now, even though you only had a pigul thought of a half a kezayit in those last two cases, where chutz zmano was only half, but since chutz zmano and chutz kamo both disqualify the korban, half a zayit of this and a half a zayit of that, remember you need a whole olive bulk for it to be an issue, combine. So we can combine half zaytim of chutz kamo and chutz zmano. We can combine whole zaytim of chutz zmano, chutz kamo, in order to say this is not karev k'mitzvato, and yes, it will be disqualified, but no, it won't be karet. Okay, that's the key. It's got two things going on. The korban is disqualified because you had a pigul thought of a kezayit, whether it's combined or not combined. But since you had two different thoughts, in some of the cases you didn't even have a full kezayit of chutz zmano, and in the other case, well, it was combined with chutz kamo. So it's the same as before. It's not going to be karet. But Amar Rabbi Yehuda, he disagrees with this whole section of the Mishnah and says, Zah klal, here's the rule. Same way he disagreed with the animals. Im machshevet azman kadma l'machshevet hamakom. If the first thought you had while you were slaughtering, your thought was, I'm going to do it outside of its time, that sets it as pigul. Even if, now you still have to sprinkle the blood, but even if when you sprinkle the blood, you had a thought, I'm going to do it outside of its place, which then makes it disqualified for some other reason, it doesn't matter because you already determined its pigul from the beginning. And if the pigul of the chutz lizmano was first, then it's going to be pigul v'chayavim alav karet. Im machshevet hamakom kadma l'machshevet hazman. If first you disqualify for some other reason, and then you have the outside of the time, which is going to make it pigul, then it's pasul ve'ein bo karet because it was already disqualified for some other reason. So the order matters. Where it's according to the Tanna Kama, for sure the order didn't matter. The Chachamim omrim zev is a pasul ve'ein bo karet, and the rabbis say no, both are pasulim and it has karet. That seems to be like Tanna Kama in the Mishnah, right? They're saying it doesn't matter, right? All of them have no karet associated with them. It doesn't matter the order. Last line, which is also a repeat from Daf Kaftet. Again, remember, Daf Kaftet was all about animals. Here we're saying the same thing about birds. That's why it's repeated. Le'echol kechatzi zayit, ulaktir kechatzi zayit. However, if your thought was, let's say, chutz lizmano, I'm going to do this outside of time, but I think that I'm going to eat a half a kezayit, only half, right? Not a full shiur, outside of its time. And then you also think at the same time, I'm going to burn a half a kezayit outside its time. That doesn't combine at all. The korban is completely good. Kashil. she'ein achila v'aktara mitzrafim, because eating and burning don't combine. You can combine chutz zmano and chutz kamo, but you can't combine a thought about eating and a thought about burning. Those don't combine. Even if they're both chutz zmano or both chutz kamo, it won't be disqualified at all. Okay. That's the start. Now we're going to share screen and we're going to use the study guide. And just find it here on my computer. Okay. Now we're going to look. Oh, I forgot to share it this way. Let's forget. Okay. Now, we're going to look at the study guide and we're going to look first at the psukim. Okay, so this is also a review of what we saw in the Mishnah, but we're going to see what the pasuk says and what it doesn't say. And now we're going to have one braita. It's a very long braita. It's going to go almost to the bottom of Amud Aleph. And it's going to darshan one by one a lot of different halakhot that come out of this section. Okay, so we're in chapter 1 of Vayikra. Chapter 1 starts off in Vayikra. They start off with the korban olah. And it says bring korban olah from animals, and then it gets to if you want to bring it from birds. And it seems to be discussing a korban nidava, a voluntary offering of birds. So if you're volunteering to bring a bird as a korban, hikriv min hatorim umin b'nei yonah korbanos. So you bring from torim or b'nei yonah. Okay. Now, this pasuk seems to indicate, okay, and this is going to be the first drasha, that it's plural. You have to bring 2 birds, just like we saw in the other cases. Bring 2 birds, one for sin, one for an olah. Like one bird sounds like it's not enough. But then the next line is, the next pasuk, vihi krivo hakohen. I'm now on pasuk tet vav. Hikrivo is singular, okay? So the kohen is going to sacrifice it. It sounds like one. So we'll get back to that. Okay, so now, the kohen brings it to the mizbeach, to the altar. And what does he do? Halakhot rosho, he does melika. He ktir mizbecha, he burns it. Now, notice it says halakhot rosho, he takes off the head. Okay, that we got. That we saw yesterday. He ktir mizbecha, he burns it on the altar. V'nimtza damo ktir mizbech. There's a little bit strange thing about the order here, because it says he burns it on the fire, and then it says he squeezes the blood out. Okay, you can't burn it and then squeeze the blood. You have to squeeze the blood before you burn it. So we'll get back to that. He sirat murata b'nosata. That's what we saw. He takes out the crop with the feather, it sounds like, with its feather, and throws that to the mizbeach. Kedma el makom hadesh. And shlich, that's what we see. He throws it. That's what we talked yesterday about throwing. This pasuk says he throws it to the makom hadesh. That's the place where they write the garbage pile. Vishisao to b'knafav. He splits it in half now. Now it seems like before, now again, there's hiktir in the pasuk tefav. In this last pasuk Yud Zayin, it also says hiktir oto. There seem to be 2 burnings. That's where we're going to get that he burns the head and he burns the body. And here we're obviously on the body because he takes, after he burns the head, he takes out of the body the parts he takes out. Then he breaks the body in half. Lo yavdil. There it says he doesn't completely sever the body. We saw that yesterday also. And then he burns that hamizbecha aleitzim asher la'esh, etc. Okay, those are the psukim. So like I said before, notice it doesn't say he splits the head from the body. Okay, so it doesn't say that explicitly. And in the pasuk of Chatat Of, if you remember, it says halakhot rosho mimul orpo v'lo yavdil. Okay, in Parak Hay, and it's also on your sheet, chapter 5, verse 8. This would be halakhot rosho mimul orpo v'lo yavdil. There it specifically says v'lo yavdil. Don't separate it, but it doesn't say that in the first, which is also a possible reason why it led them to believe you do have to separate it. Okay, so here starts a long braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Vihi krivo matamul lamar. Why does it say vihi krivo in singular? Right? Lafisha ne'amar vihi krivo natorim umim b'nei yonah. Well, the pasuk before was plural. So you might have thought, you might have thought if you voluntarily say, I'm bringing a korban olah from a bird, maybe you have to bring 2. So therefore, Talmud Lamar v'krivo afilu preda achat yafi. You can even bring just 1 bird. Okay, that's why it moves to singular. It sounds like the standard is 2, but if you want to bring 1, you can bring 1. El mizbeach. So now it says v'krivo akohen el mizbeach. Now what they're saying here is it could have just said hikrivo el mizbeach, because who else goes near the altar but the kohen? So ma Talmud Lamar hakohen. So why does it tell you hakohen? Obviously it's the kohen. Who else would do that? Well, l'gabah lo kohen, to tell you need to have a kohen. Now, why would you need to say you need to have a kohen? This is the avodot of the bird. Wouldn't you think it's obvious it has to be a kohen? Well, no, of course not. What's melika? Melika is like shchita. Remember shchita? Shchita can be done by anybody, right? Even women, remember? So, shiachov alo dinu. You might have thought it's just logical. Ma ben son shekavalo tzafon lo kavalo kohen. If you have a ben son, an animal, and there you have to do it in the north, right, for the korban ola. So it's more strict. But lo kavalo kohen. But a kohen doesn't have to do the slaughtering. The slaughtering has to happen in the north. But anybody can do the slaughtering. So off shelo kavalo tzafon enudin shelo yigbalo kohen. So in a bird where it doesn't specifically have to be in the north, wouldn't you think then that it would be at least the same as the animal and you wouldn't need a kohen to do it? Talmud lamal ha-kohen, likboa lo kohen. That's why it says ikriva kohen, for you to know. Melika has to be done by the kohen, which is, again, melika is parallel to shchita. For the animal it doesn't need to be, but for the bird it does. Okay, next halacha. So we have so far one bird, we have kohen has to do it, the melika. Right? Obviously, all the other actions have to be done by a kohen, like in the animals, but also melika. Yachol yimlekenu b'sakin. You might have thought you need a knife. And again, vidinu, logical. Ma'im shchita shelo kavala kohen kavala kli. Now in shchita, you don't even need a kohen, and yet you need a kli, you need a knife. Melika shekavala kohen enudin shikbala kli. So melika, where you have to have a kohen, don't you think then you would need a vessel? You would need a knife. Talmud lomar kohen umalak. So they say they learn it from the words Yikriva Kohen al Mizbech umalak. Okay, we don't yet know how they learn it, but what they were going to learn is it has to be done with the body of the Kohen. How do we get that? Rabbi Akiva comes to explain the drasha. Amar Rabbi Akiva, v'chit halel da'atcha shezar karev l'gabei Mizbech. This is what I said before, right? If they're bringing it to the altar, of course it's going to be a Kohen, because no zar would go near the altar. Elamatom ulamar Kohen. Melika ba'atzmo shel kohen. Why does it say kohen? To say that the melika has to be done by the body of the kohen. That's how we get it. Okay, next issue. Yachol, this is, like I said, very long braita. We're still in the braita. Yachol yimlekenu bein milamala bein milamata. What's nice about this braita is, right, in the Mishna, and this is classic for a Mishna versus Midrash halacha, for a Mishna you just get the halakhot. This teaches you how they got to the halakhot. So, again, you always have to question what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the drasha kadma to the right. Is it because the pasuk says is they derive the halacha from there, or do they know the halacha and they're showing it? How do we get it from the psukim? That's always a question. I'm going to leave that as an open question. But here you do see their logic and thought and where they're getting things from. Maybe you could do melika up top or down below. It doesn't matter. Talmud lomar umalak v'iktir. Now we're going to see the word malak comes right next to, right, malak et rosho, and then hiktir. So they're going to say the melika has to happen right where the burning happens. Where is that? Mak tara b'rosh mizbech, af melika b'rosh mizbech. So since the melika, the burning is up on top of the altar, also the melika is on top of the altar. Umalak mimul oref. So where do you do the melika? From the back of the neck. So now they ask again. Ata omer mimul oref oenu ela min hatzaval. Now, it would be naturally the front of the neck, because that's how we do slaughtering in general. So how'd you get to the back of the neck? It doesn't say mimul or po here. But, right, vidinu, it's just going to be logical. Why? Because ne'emar kan umalak v'ne'emar lahala malak. This is what we call a binyan av. It says malak here, and it says malak in the pasuk of the chatara of, in the second section here on the sheet. Right, in Vayikra Hey, Psukim Zayin to Tet, it says malak et rosho. Next words, mimul or po. So, Malahala mimul oref, afka mimul oref. So here it didn't specify, there it specified, that's what we get. The problem is, if we say that this is boneh av, what does it say there? Umalaka risho rosho mimul or po v'lo yavdil. Then we should also say the same thing, lo yavdil, applies here as well. Ima lahala molek ve'eno mavdil. If that's going to build a paradigm for here, then there it's melika without splitting the head, severing the head from the body. Afka molek ve'eno mavdil. So wouldn't you think that? Talmud lomar umalak v'hiktir. Well, it says umalak v'hiktir by us, right? You do melika and then you burn it. Mak tara harosh latzmo v'aguf latzmo. Now, we're going to see this later, how we get this, but the burning of the head is done separately from the burning of the body. So therefore, since melika comes right next to v'hiktir, which is done separately, the assumption is af melika harosh latzmo v'aguf latzmo. So also melika, it has to be the head and the body separately. It doesn't mean you do melika to both. It just means the melika severs that from that. Uminayin, now we get back to that last point. Minayin shaktarat harosh batzmo v'aguf batzmo. How do we know that the burning is done separately? Shene'amar, viktiroto. Now, in the last pasuk it says, right, split it in half, but don't completely sever it. Vihiktiroto akoin hamizbecha. Now, hareach taratu gufa murad. That must be the body. How do we know that? Right? Hamani mekayem viktir hamizbecha. Go back to psukim. It already said you burn it on the altar. So baktarat harosh hakatu mitaber. So the last pasuk is obviously talking about the body because it says you split the body in between the wings, right? So that's obviously the body. So therefore, since there's two words, the two times where the verse says tiroto and hamizbecha and tira hamizbecha, it must be the first one is the head and the second one is the body. And from there we learn they're done separately. So that was just a question within a question, right? Once we had that drasha, we had to explain the background to it. Vinim tzadamo kulo. Now this is a unique halacha here. Okay, generally we have sprinkling of the blood, we have squeezing of the blood, we have all different kinds of things. But usually there's the sprinkling, the first stage, and then the second stage, which is the remainder. Now here it says, Nimtza damo al kira mizbech. What they learn here is it says, Nimtza damo, squeeze out the blood, and it doesn't say squeeze from the blood. If it said midamo, you would say some of it and not all of it. And also there would be a pasuk later saying what to do with the remainder. Here there's no pasuk saying what to do with the remainder, and it says, squeeze out its blood, which sounds like squeeze out all of its blood. Okay, and that's what we get. All the blood is squeezed out. We don't leave anything over. There is no remainder to deal with later. Next words, al kira mizbech, on the wall of the altar. What do you get from here? It has to be on the wall of the altar, right? Now, v'lo al kira kevesh, v'lo al kira hayichal. Right, we saw this before, not on the wall of the ramp, not on the wall of the heichal, of the sanctuary, the ezazeh. And which wall is this? Or which part of the wall of the mizbech? We know it's on the mizbech, but which one? Zeh kira halyon. This is what we said before. It's done on the upper part of the altar. Oh, we know ala kira tachton. Maybe it's on the bottom part of the altar. Now we're going to do the same logic we did yesterday, but the reverse. Vidinu would be logical. Now in the animal, the sin offering is at the top. The burnt offering is at the bottom. So in a bird, shechatato lamata, which we know from yesterday's daf, that the burnt offering, the sin offering, which is done at the top in the animal, is done at the bottom with a bird offering. So eno din sholato lamata. So wouldn't you then think if the ola of animal is down and the sin offering of a bird is down when the sin offering in general is up? So wouldn't you assume then the ola of the bird should be down? Talmud Lomar. So how do we get that it's not at the bottom part of the altar? Umalak v'iktir v'nimtza damo. Now here is an interesting pasuk. It says, we've read this a few times, but what's the problem with this? You do melika, you burn it, and then you squeeze the blood out. Now what's the problem? You can't squeeze the blood if you've already burnt it. We said that before. So I said it, right? We hadn't gotten to it. Now, here we're getting to it. V'chit halal tatcha. Would you possibly think that after you burn it, you squeeze out the blood? Ela, no, so obviously not. So why is it coming in this order? It's to tell you that the sprinkling of the blood has to happen also at the top of the altar. Okay, so you have to do the melika, then the blood, then the burning, but all of it has to happen in the same place. So so how do we do this? Now we get to the description we saw in the Mishna. Okay, the braita has the same description. You go up the ramp, panal sovev, you turn right to the corner there. You go up the mizbeach onto the ledge. Right? You don't go up to the top. You go to the ledge. Right? That's 6 cubits of height. So you go to the 6 cubit. You turn on that ledge. Balo the keren dromit mizrachit. You stand on that corner, the southeast corner. Hayamoleket rosha mimul orpa. Right? So you do the melika like we did yesterday on the back of the neck. Umavdil, and you separate it completely. Umimatzemi damal kira mizbeach, and then you squeeze out all the blood on the wall. Right? On the wall above you, presumably, right? Because you're standing at 6 cubits of height. It has to be above the chud hasikra, which is 1 cubit below you at the 5th amma, and you squeeze the blood out there. If you did it below your feet, meaning you're standing there, you're holding this. Remember, you squeeze it and you kind of push it up against the wall as you're squeezing it to get the blood on the wall. If you bend down and you do it below you, we actually mentioned this a while ago and some other sugya came up. up to 1 cubit, it's fine because you're still at the upper part of the altar. So theoretically, right, normally you're going to stand up there and squeeze the blood above. But if you bend down and do it below, you have up to 1 cubit of space to squeeze the blood below. Okay. That is assuming, like our Mishnah, that you're standing on the sovev, the ledge. But comes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and this is how the braita ends. This very, very long braita, we bring a dissenting opinion here. Omrim, kol atzma eina naset ela b'rosh hamizbeach. What are you talking about? The whole thing is done at the top of the altar. You go up that ramp all the way to the top. You don't go on the ledge. You don't do this on the ledge. So he disagrees with the Tan in the braita, and he disagrees with the Tan of our Mishnah. Gemara ends this section with my benayu. What's the difference between them? Abai v'Rava d'amar travayu. Oh, what's the root of the machloket really? We have a disagreement about whether you can make a fire on that ledge. If you think about the ledge, it's only 1 cubit of width. It sounds like a strange place to start making a fire. But remember what we said. The melika has to happen in the same place as the blood, as the burning. So we don't want you to have to go from the sovev up to the altar. So if you can do the burning on the sovev, then you do it on the sovev. If you can't do it on the sovev, then we're going to say you go up to the top. And that's Rabbi Nechemia, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov think you can't make a fire on the ledge there, right? Maybe because it's not safe, I don't know why, but you can't make a fire there. Not the place for the fires, but the other opinion says you can. Now, I just want you to think about it. We're talking about burning a bird. Obviously, it's a very small fire. So even though there's not a lot of space, we're talking about a very small fire. You can make something like that, right? The bird is teeny, right? If he holds it in his hand and does the melika all in his hand, right? It was said yesterday. So we're talking about very small, so that's why theoretically you could have a fire, but there's machloket about whether you really can or not. Okay, that was the first braita with a lot of different halakhot and where we got them from the psukim. Now we're going to get to the part about the morah benotzata, okay? And what the parts that you throw in the Beit HaDeshen. I'm just going to remind you. It says morah benotzata in the pasuk, okay? It says hisirat morato benotzata. It sounds like you take out the crop with its feathers. But in the Mishnah, we saw there were 3 things you throw. And you also throw the innards, which it definitely doesn't say in the pasuk. And we don't know where they get this from. Now we're going to see. Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to see different opinions about how to understand this pasuk. Hisirat morato benotzata. Zozefek. That's the crop. Yachol yakdir b'sakin v'yatlenu. Now you might think you just cut a hole in the opening of the throat, right? You open the throat already, and then you just make a hole. Take it out by itself, like from the inside, just the inner part. Well, Talmud Lomar b'notzata. That's why it says with notzata, you're supposed to take it notela tanutzayima. You have to take it with some of the feathers also. In other words, you don't just scoop it out, but you take that whole section, also the skin around it that has the feather on it. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan omer notla v'notel korkavana ima. He says you take it out and you take the gizzard with it. That's where I said it chops up the food after it softens in the crop. It's further in the gizzard. He says you take the gizzard out with it. That's some people say that's our Mishnah. It talks about the innards. The innards mean the gizzard, even though there's also small intestines beyond that. But the innards are the gizzard. And some people think it's the same opinion. Where does he get it from? So there are different opinions about this exactly. But Rashi says notzata doesn't mean feather. And he proves it from Eicha. It says kinatsu gamnao, that notza is a bad thing. Okay, so therefore they're going to say it's something despicable. So what they're talking about, the notza, is the gizzard, which is kind of gross. It's the innards. So because that's where the food gets chopped up. So they're saying that the notza is actually pulling out the gizzard. Now, obviously, you'd have to say it's both the feather and the gizzard according to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah mentions all 3. So maybe our Mishnah is some sort of combination approach here. Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tana bin notzata benotza shela. He says no. Benotzata is with its own feather, meaning the crop's feathers. Meaning kodra b'sakin kimina ruba. You cut it out like a shoot, like a circle kind of thing, and then you take it out the whole section. You cut off that whole section with the feathers. Okay, so it seems like it's unclear exactly what exactly differentiates these 3 different opinions. It seems like some people say Rabbi Yishmael is actually the same as Tanakama, okay, because it does sound the same thing. That you're taking out the crop with its feathers. You're not taking out the gizzard, right? According to those. Shisa v'lo hivdil. Turning now to Amud Bet. Now we're up to the. So Miriam, you're asking is with hands or with tools. It says a sakin. So you take it with a sakin. It sounds like Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan. It sounds like perhaps you're just taking it out with your hands. It doesn't say anything about a knife. It sounds like he's taking it out with his hands, because again, the purpose of the knife is not to separate, right, to be able to have it with the feathers along with it. Its own feathers, right, have them with it. Okay. We're not getting into tameh mitzvot here, why you're doing this, right? We don't really know. I mean, it says so in the pasuk, so that's why. Just figure out what the pasuk means. Okay, turning now to Amud Bet. Shisa v'lo hivdil. So now you cut the body in half, but you don't completely cut it in half, right? You cut it like on one side and then it opens. Tanu Rabbanan v'shisa. Okay, based on your question, Miriam, the Gemara was also wondering about this. Ein shisua ela b'yad. We're talking about slicing something in half or cutting it in half. It's not slicing with a knife. It's breaking with your hands. How do we know this? V'cheinu omel, and exactly we're going to quote from Shimshon. Vayishas ehu kishesa hagdi. Okay, he basically comes upon this lion and he cuts him in half. He breaks him in half, like you do with a baby goat. Okay, right, which is a lot easier than a lion. And they didn't give you the key words. Okay, and there was nothing in his hands. Okay, meaning he didn't have any implement. He did this with his bare hands. So that's how we get that you have to do this with your bare hands. Now we get to the last section of our Gemara. And this last section is going to relate to not things we talked about yet today, really, but in the Mishna yesterday we saw they start quoting it from Lo Yisir Tamor Abed. It's not really on that part that they're interested in. After the Mishna went through all the details of what you're supposed to do, it said, what if you didn't do that, you didn't do that, you didn't do that? Okay, it's fine. Then it says, and this is the key line, if you did Havdalah, you separated completely by the Chatat HaOf, or you didn't do Havdalah by the Olat HaOf, it's disqualified. So that issue of lavdil or not lavdil is critical, okay? And it disqualifies the sacrifice. Well, comes the Gemara and says, this is only one opinion. Matnitin de lo ke Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. This mission does not match the opinion of Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Okay, this is the last chart on the page. I don't know if I'll share it, but you can look at the chart on the page. It's going to differentiate between who says what, and then there's 3 different opinions about what the machloket is between them. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. So first we're going to see his opinion. Shamati, I have a tradition, I was taught, Shemavdilim bechatat ha'of, that you actually can sever the head in chatat ha'of. Not that you have to, but you can. Okay? Now, so he says basically, I learned that you can sever the head, not that you have to, right? And that's again, we learned you're not allowed to. And in fact, the Torah says you're not allowed to. But he says, I learned that you could if you wanted to. My benai. Now, clearly, Tan of our Mishnah says no way, no how. Because he says, if you don't, right, if you sever the head in the chatat ha'of. Again, we're switching topics now. Because the focus now is the sin offering. We've been talking about the burnt offering, where you do sever the head. But the Mishnah had combined them both. If you do that to that one and that one to that one, right, it's all messed up. So he says, I heard that you can do it for the chatat ha'of. My benayu. I'm Rav Chisda. Now, before we get to Rav Chisda, and then we're going to have Rava, and then Abaye, we have to understand something basic, which is the next Mishnah. Okay, tomorrow we're going to start the new chapter, the 7th parak, and there it says, chatat ha'of, if you do the chatat ha'of, I'm just skipping a line, kema'aseh olah l'shem chatat. If you do the bird offering for the sin one, but you do it, your actions are the same as the olah, but you say I'm doing it for the purposes of a chatat, it's a problem. Okay, so to understand this better, we have to understand what are the critical actions for an olah. So the 2 main critical actions that have to happen, okay, you can see the list on the chart, on the sheet, of all the different actions. Okay, this is just a review. Differences between the olat ha'of and similarities, right? Both of them need melika, but olat ha'of you're mavdil, and chatat ha'of you're not mavdil. That's critical for the olat ha'of. We know that from our Mishnah. You have to be mavdil. Mitzoi hadam, okay, you do the mitzoi, the squeezing from the head and from the body. In the chatat ha'of, it's hazayat hadam. It's sprinkling the blood, and you do mitzoi, but the mitzoi is only the remainder of the blood, if you remember. The squeezing is with the remainder. Then you have to, in the olah, burn the head and burn the body. Okay, I put those separate, burning the head and also burning the body. And you have to take out the morah and all that stuff. And you have to cut the body in half, but without cutting it completely. In the chatat, if you don't burn anything, you can just eat it. The kohanim can eat it. But the 2 critical elements that have to happen are the melika and the mitzoi adam. Okay, that's essentially olah ha'of. Now what we're going to talk about here in our thinking about what's this machloket, it's going to be about which things in the chatat ha'of are essential. Okay, because what we want to try to make sure is that when you're doing the chatat ha'of, now one of the reasons to make sure, okay, now what's the issue? If you do the chatat ha'of in the same way you do the ola, we learned in the next Mishnah, it's a problem, it's disqualified. So we don't want to have a situation where you do melika, where you're separating the head, and you're doing mitzoi hadam. Now, you do mitzoi hadam anyway in the chatat ha'of, because you do that with the remainder. So if you end up in the chatat ha'of doing mitzoi and melika with separating the head completely, you've basically done it like the olat ha'of, because those are the only two essential actions. So we want to avoid that from happening. So how do we do that? So, and why is there a machloket here? So this is exactly the point. I'm a Rav Chisda. I'm going to have three different ways of reading this. Mitzui chatat ha'of ma'akev ika benayu. The machloket is the mitzui of the remainder of the blood of the chatat, of the sin offering, is that critical? Now why? Because like this, here we'll read it inside. Tanakama savar mitzui chatat ha'of ma'akev. That is essential. In other words, in the chatat ha'of you have to do melika, sprinkling the blood, and also the mitzui, the squeezing of the blood. Now, kevan de mitzui dam ka'avid, kevan de mitzui dam ma'akev, it's just missing a word there, ka'avid ma'aseh olah b'chatat ha'of. So comes Tanakama and says, if mitzui is essential, and you sever the head completely in the chatat ha'of, what's going to happen? You've done melika with severing the head, and you've done mitzui. You've done now the same actions of the ola in the chatat, and that's a problem based on our next Mishnah. What we're basically saying, I just want to be clear here, is that we're basically saying that the Tanakam of our Mishnah that disqualifies separating the head of the chatat ha'of is saying the reason in this Mishnah why it's disqualified is because of the next Mishnah. Okay? That it's disqualified because then there's no other way to do the chatat. Once you sever the head and you have to do the mitzvah of the remainder, even though you've sprinkled some blood in between, you've basically done the two main actions of the ola, and it's as if you did your chatat like an ola. Rabbi Shimon savar mitzvah chatat ha'of lo ma'akev. No, you have to do the haza'ah, right? You have to sprinkle it, but you don't have to do mitzvah. So let's say I was doing melika. Okay, I'm not a Kohen and I'm not a male, but a male Kohen is doing the melika. And they completely sever the head of the chatat. So according to Rabbi Shimon, so fine. So they just won't do mitzvah. And with that, they'll be able to avoid having it be done exactly like the ola. And therefore, if you don't do mitzvah, mechatech basar ba'almahu. The fact that you did Havdalah is not because you were trying to do it like an ola. It was just stam, you just cut the flesh. It's fine. It's not like, if you're doing it because you want to do it like an ola, that's a problem. But here, if you have a way to redeem yourself kind of thing by not doing mitzvah, and then retroactively it becomes like, oh, you just cut some meat, cut some flesh. Rava Amal, second option, Shehiyah b'siman sheni ba'olat ha'of ma'akev ika benayu. Okay, this is a whole thing in and of itself. Shehiyah is a concept in kashrut. Okay, when you're slaughtering animals in general. When you're slaughtering animals, you have to cut both simanim. Okay, you have the trachea and the esophagus. You can't take a break in between. Okay, there's a certain amount of time you're not allowed to wait in between doing. You have to do it kind of one right after the other, or at once. Okay, now if you wait, it disqualifies it. In a bird, when you slaughter a bird, you only have to cut one siman. That's enough. So, let's say you cut both simanim and you took a break in the middle. Is that disqualifying it or not? So that's the machloka between them, about shehiyah b'siman sheni ba'olat ha'of ma'akev. Now, in general, in a bird, in a regular slaughtering of a bird, you don't need to do the second siman, so of course shehiyah is not going to disqualify, okay, regular slaughtering of a bird. Also, chatat ha'of, it's not going to disqualify, because in the chatat ha'of, you only have to do one siman. But in the olat ha'of, in the burnt offering of the bird, you have to cut both simanim, because you have to sever the head completely. You can't sever the head completely unless you cut the trachea and the esophagus. So, since you have to cut them both, is it like an animal? And is shehiyah going to disqualify? Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Good question. So let's see. But that's the machloket. The machloket is, just like shehiyah is a problem between both simanim and the animal, is that true for the olat ha'of, where you also need to cut both simanim? Okay, it's obviously not true for the chatat ha'of because you only have to do one. It's obviously not true for the regular birds that you're slaughtering because you only have to do one. It's only a question by the olat ha'of, and that's the machloket. Tanakama saval, again, this is what Rabbi thinks the machloket is between Tanakama and Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shimon, sorry. Tanakama savar, shehiyah b'siman sheni ba'olat ha'of lo ma'akev. So Tanakama says, this waiting doesn't ruin it, okay? Which means what? Now, the assumption is, since in the chatat ha'of, or let's say you waited, okay? So if I slaughter, I cut one siman, which is all I have to do in the chatat ha'of, then I wait, and then I do the other one, and I completely sever the head after I've waited. Now, if this is a disqualification in the olat ha'of, if it's not a disqualification in the olat ha'of, and that would mean it's a perfectly good melika for the olat ha'of, right? Then basically, kaveh maseh olah b'chatat. Then again, what's my problem? Well, I did a complete severing of the head, just like I would do in a bird, right? A burnt bird offering. And then I've basically done the maseh olat ha'of, assuming I do mitzvah, which you would have to say, I guess they all think mitzvah is ma'akev here. And then, be a problem. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon savar ma'akev. He says, what do you mean? You're not allowed to do that in a slaughtering of an olat ha'of, of the burnt offering, because you have to do both simanim, and you've waited in between. It's disqualified, just like it's disqualified in an animal. If it's disqualified, and let's say you do that for the chatat ha'of, well, if you do it for the chatat ha'of and you waited in between, then kevan deshaye, since you waited, mechatech basar ba'almahu. The fact that after you then cut the second siman and completely sever the head is irrelevant. Because it's not like you did it like the ola. It would be disqualified in an ola because you waited. So that's why he thinks this is totally fine. Third explanation. Abaye amal rov basar ma'akev ikabinayu. Okay, now, we said that you have to cut one siman, but there's more to it than that. You also have to cut there's two things going on in the throat. Okay, there's the trachea and the esophagus, and there's flesh around there. There's, it's a meaty area also. So do you have to, now generally what you do is you cut one siman and you get to like a little past half of the flesh there, and you cut around there. After you cut the siman, you then cut the flesh around so that you've severed more than half of the head. Okay? Now the question is, when you do that, is that critical? Do you have to do the rov basar or not? So, they're all going to think she has a problem according to this. Now, if you have to do that element of it, then you're basically going to end up, after you cut the first siman on the chatat ha'of, you're going to then cut most of the basar, and then you're going to chop the rest of the head off, right? If in the case where you chop the head, you don't need to. But by nature, if you have to cut rova basar, then you've already waited in between, and then that's not going to be like an ola anymore. So so the way it's going to work is, the Gemara doesn't explain this, even though this I think is the most complicated one. They should have explained it. But Rashi explains it. But Rashi says here, and later on, further down the daf, Rov basar ma'akev ikabinayu, right? Everybody thinks that shehiyah in an ola is a disqualifying thing. And the machloket is, Tanakama savar rov chituch rov basar b'chata lo ma'akev. It's not ma'akev rov basar, which means that you can theoretically go ahead and just cut one, cut the other, and then cut the head completely, and that would be a problem, because that would be just like the ola, because you didn't wait in between. But according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, that you have to cut rov basar, so you're going to cut the first siman, cut rov basar, and then you'll continue and cut the rest. But once you add shia, it will be no longer good for an ola offering, which means that no one will say, oh, you did this like an ola, because that wouldn't have worked for an ola. Okay, so it's all the same theory, okay, the same concept here. That if something's ma'akev in the ola, right, then it's gonna, or if it's ma'akev, depending on what, right, then it will either look like the ola, it won't look like an ola. As long as it doesn't look like an ola, it's going to be okay. Now they're just going to point out that the Rav and Abai machloket, is it shehiyah or is it rov basar ma'akev, beplukted Rabbi Zera Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak. They had the same halakhot between Rav and Abai. Chad amar shehiyah b'siman sheni bolada of ma'akev ikabenayu, v'chad amar rov basar ma'akev ikabenayu. Okay, they each said one said what Rav said, one said what Abai said. Now they're going to say michlal de be'inan rov basar b'tchila. Now this whole premise of Abai is what? That the rov basar has to happen before you cut the second siman, right? In that thing. So, right, in the chatat ha'of, that you have to do that first. Is that really so? They say, yes it is. Va'atanya will prove it to you from a braita. Ketzad, here's the description of how you do melika in chatat ha'of. Ketzad mochim chatat ha'of. Chotech shidra u'mafreket, below rov basar. So you cut the back, the spinal cord and mafreket. I'm not sure what the mafreket is. Without rov basar. Okay, so you cut I guess this would be where the one of the simanim are, right? So you cut first I guess it's really the back, the neck bone in the back there, without rov basar yet. Ad shemigia, oh, you're helping me, the nape. Okay, the nape of the neck. Ad shemigia laveshet ola kaneh. Okay, so first you break, remember, you go through the back. So you have to break that bone in the back of the neck. Then what you need to do is, you need to get to one of the simanim, the veshet or the kaneh. Remember, he's doing this all with his finger. Higia laveshet ola kaneh, chotech siman echad o rubo. So you have to break one of them, or the majority of it is sufficient. Virov basar imo, and then you have to do the majority of the basar with that. Uba ola shnaim or rov shnaim. Okay, in the ola you have to do two or the majority of both. Anyway, the point being that the rov basar has to happen right after you do that. So there you have it. Okay? Then we're going to have that they told us in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he started questioning them, and we're going to get to that after. So we'll stop here because that really just is a big thing about who said what and blah, 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 and we'll get to the content of it tomorrow. So we did today, quick review, we started with all those pigul cases. It's not pigul lo kareva matir in the normal manner. We had the zayid and kazayid, which ones are mitzdarif for what purpose, and we saw all the different permutations. We saw the machloket Rabbi Yehuda about if it's chutzes mano first and some other disqualification actually is pigul that you have karet. Of course, the rabbis clearly thought no, and the Tanakama thought no. Then we got to that long braita of all the drashot, of where we got most of the halakhot in the Mishna and some more that all came out from those psukim. Okay, the braita is, again, midrash halakha, where we want to tell you the halakha. We want to talk about the logic of how we got there, and even they suggested, logic might have stated otherwise, and the verse says this, and that's why we learned that. And then we dealt with the Moran, the Notzah. We had a separate braita that talked about what exactly that is, 3 different opinions, or maybe 2. It was listed as 3, but maybe 2 were the same. Then we got to how do we split it in half, right? We break it in half by hand, like Shimshon. And then we ended with this issue of, can you split the head completely in the chata? We seem to have a machloket. Our Mishna said no way, no how. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon said you can. And 3 possible ways, Rav Chisda, Rav, and Abai, about what the machloket is. Either which way, the machloket, according to all of them, had something to do with it, or had to do with the next Mishnah, which is, we don't want you to do the chatan in the way the ola is done, and we have to avoid that. So their machloket is based on, well, are there other ways to avoid it, and therefore Havdalah would not be a problem. Okay, if there's no other way to avoid it, then Havdalah is going to be a problem. Because again, if you have to do, again, it depends whether you have to do mitzvah or you don't. But remember, those are the 2 critical things in the ola, the mitzvah adam and the Havdalah. So it has to differ from that in some way, and then we have 3 different ways to understand it. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.